Okay. I really liked Janet Planet. It's a story told from the perspective of an 11-year-old girl spending a summer with her single mother and an assortment of house guests. Protagonist Lacey seeing behavior of the adults around her that she may not understand at the time, but will looking back. Mild spoiler warning because I'm going to talk about a scene that takes place at about the midpoint. If you care about that, here's the station to get off and watch it on Max. There's a scene in which Lacey's mother, Janet, and her friend Regina take psychedelic drugs together. I think it's fascinating how often tripping scenes are in movies because there's a lot of reasons for filmmakers to gravitate towards them. They allow for the internal world of a character to be visually reflected in the frame, really making use of film as a visual medium. To pick some recent examples, Midsummer went the realistic route, trying to mimic visual distortions of real-life drug use, whereas The Worst Person in the World went for a more metaphorical approach. But what's interesting about Janet Planet is that the altered perceptions are communicated almost entirely by the actors. Remember, we're getting Lacey's perspective. She's not on drugs, she's only observing, as we are, the ways in which it makes her mother and long-term down-on-her-luck house guest Regina seem unfamiliar. Janet is pacing back and forth, her eyes following a string threaded through the events that have defined her life.
So, you develop an identity. You develop an identity as an untrustworthy person, untrustworthy to yourself. And so that, I mean, once you're in that pattern, that's how you make bad decisions.
This, in contrast to the more morose and depressed person we and Lacey have seen for the rest of the movie, communicates the transcendent experience she's having. And then she comes to this moment of clarity where she realizes that defining choices that she's made, even if they've served her or her daughter poorly, as quote-unquote bad, carries a lot of judgment and self-hate.
Who's to say but me whether it's a bad decision?
And then Regina says,
but objectively, you do make bad decisions.
Janet, understandably, doesn't take this particularly well.
I was onto something and I was being kind to myself for once, and you stepped on my toe.
Regina is communicating a lot here too. She takes everything Janet says with this really tangible weight, absorbing it and then recomposing herself to respond. It's driven home that they're both having deeply affecting experiences composed inside their own heads, but they're not the same ones.
You do make bad decisions sometimes, but you're facing up to it.
But you don't know me. You haven't seen me for years.
And we see Janet coming to a new clarity about Regina as a person.
You gave away all of your money. You can't pay a month's rent.
She's recognizing her dependence on Regina for validation, and that perhaps she doesn't need someone else's approval to feel good about herself, particularly not this person. It's reinforced by Regina being visibly constricted, sitting down and hunched, while Janet is proud, hands on hips, standing on 2 feet. Regina even tries to get Janet to sit at one point, bringing her down to her level.
You should sit down. Lacey, can you get some water?
It's a powerful scene, made more powerful by the fact that both characters are kind of correct. Yes, Janet has made decisions, particularly in regards to relationships with men, that have caused her and her daughter great hardship. But also, Regina is relying on Janet's hospitality and presuming a level of familiarity that isn't there. And it's a powerful moment for Janet to be able to value her interpretation of herself over someone else's. I love this movie, and while it's not the lightest thing on earth, it's a pretty sweet watch right now, and could be something to focus on if you can't get your head away from the fact that they tried to run an 82-year-old man with a negative 15 approval rating for president when 2/3 of Democrats didn't want it, fought like hell against replacing him when it became clear he wasn't fit, and made no attempt to distance from him when there was a new candidate.